Hello, Mel. Welcome to your tutorial on how to make challah. I have all my ingredients out and you have the recipe, and maybe I'll say them as I go along. And the first thing I do is put on my Shabbos prep playlist, which I'll play from my phone on shuffle. Some background noise. And then I wipe down the surface. Where I'm gonna need the dough. Use soap and water. To make a nice clean space for the dough. Now we're going to activate the yeast. I'm doing a single recipe, so you're going to do a different amount than me. I'm going to do 2 teaspoons of yeast. One and a half teaspoons of sugar. And then for the water, it has to be warm. It's best if it's warm water, not too cold because then the yeast won't activate, and not too hot because you don't want to kill the yeast. So it should be about warm. Then I take a fork and I just mix it up to activate the yeast and mix it with the sugar. And then I let it sit for a few minutes to make sure that the yeast is eating the sugar and activating. And you can smell it. It smells like yeast, and it'll, as it starts activating, you'll see it bubble up. Okay, now I'm going to show you what the yeast looks like when it's activating. You can see that circle in the middle is all yeast that's bubbling up. So it's ready to keep going. So next we'll do oil. I'm using olive oil. You can use canola oil if you want, and I'm putting a 1/4 cup. And then I'm going to, my playlist. Then I'm going to put the eggs. And I'm doing 2 eggs. And it's actually best if the eggs are room temperature, so if you can take them out early, that's best. And I'm mixing them in. I'm just using a fork, but you can use a whisk. And then I'm going to put honey instead of sugar. And what's nice about this recipe is that the oil and the honey is the same amount, and the 1/4 cup already has oil in it, so it makes the honey not stick. And if you put a little extra honey, great! It's also important to have warm water in the beginning if you use honey, to make the honey dissolve in into the rest of the liquids. Mix the honey in there. One and a half teaspoons of salt. And then the next thing is to add flour. And I usually don't do the full. I think in the double recipe it says 8 cups. I think I usually do about 7. But I'll add in the first 3 or so and mix, and then add in 1 more, and then add in 1 more. And sometimes I get confused about how many cups I put in already. So I make note to myself of how many I've already put in when I'm doing the double recipe. The single recipe calls for 4 cups, and I'll probably just put in 3 right now. 2 in the mix, and then a little more. One. 2. Now I'm going to mix it up. And I'm watching the clumps the clumps of flour get incorporated into the mixture. I'm going to bring it over here. You can't see it. Add a 1/3 cup. It's still too sticky to put on the counter. So I'll put a little more flour in before I put it on the counter. And I don't put the whole 4th cup in. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit in and put some on the counter. And if I had any rings or watches on, I would take them off. now I take the dough and I knead the dough. I fold the flour in. And you don't want it to be too sticky. You'll keep adding flour. Like right now it's too soft. I can tell. It's too floppy, so it needs more flour. But you add it a little bit at a time so it can absorb it. You want to make sure it doesn't stick on the bottom, so you keep adding flour here. And as you knead it, the dough will absorb more flour and you might have to add more flour. If your dough is too sticky or it's too floppy, then it won't hold its shape later when you braid it. It'll just melt into itself. And when I'm kneading the dough, I think about some prayers I have for the Shabbos dinner I'm cooking it for, and the people who are going to be there, and what I want them to spiritually eat when they physically eat this bread of our ancestors. Or what do I want to feed the ancestors? And I think about those prayers and thoughts in my head and in my heart as I'm kneading the dough. So it gets to a point where it doesn't keep getting super sticky quickly, and it's holding its shape better. Might need just a little more. So I'm almost done kneading the dough. And you don't want to do folding. You don't want to fold the dough when you're kneading it, because that will create more bubbles inside. But you just want to mix the dough with the flour and like push into it. I'm turning the dough a teeny bit and just pushing down on it. So I'm not folding it over on itself. Yeah, and it's almost ready. Wow, this time I actually used all 4 cups before braiding. In the double recipe, I usually use 7 in this first part, and then I save the 8th cup if I need it for braiding. I mean, I won't need a whole nother cup for braiding, but okay. It's holding its shape. It makes you can see a little bit of finger marks from where I held it. That's fine. Generally, it's holding its shape. It's not melting through my fingers or anything. But it's soft still. You don't want it to be too dense. Too dense means too much flour. And now I'll wash the bowl out. And then I take my clean bowl and I'm going to put olive oil. Line it with a little bit of olive oil so the dough won't stick. Just put a little bit in there and then go like this. Up on the sides too, because it's going to rise. And then I take my dough and I put it in there and I put a little bit of olive oil on the dough. So that it doesn't get like stale or hard on the top. And then put saran wrap. And when you set it somewhere to rise for some hours, you put it somewhere, ideally that's a little bit warm, but not in direct sunlight. You don't want it to rise too quickly. You don't want it to be in a hot environment, because if it rises too quickly, it could get overproofed. In Oakland, when it was cold, I would put a warm water bottle, that I use during noontime, underneath it to help it rise, but you don't want it to rise too quickly. So just put it somewhere, maybe in the kitchen, where it will get ambient warmth from your other cooking. Some people will turn the oven on and then turn it off and put it in the oven when the oven's off. And then you're going to let it rise for a few hours. And you don't want it to rise all day long, because then it'll get overproofed. And the best thing is to come back after a few hours, knead it again with some more flour, and then braid it and let it rise for another maybe hour before you bake it. Okay, we're gonna say goodbye for now. Okay, we're back to braid the challah. Time to wash hands. I'm putting this in the video. We soap. And now we're going to look at how the dough is doing. Mine rose a lot. I did end up using a water bottle today because it's really cold here. And it looks good. So I'm going to bring it over to the counter, and you'll see it's immediately going to de-puff when I touch it, which is normal. It's going to sink in size, and that's okay. Hey, Petey, you want to help me braid the challah? Oh, you do you? Think you would just eat the dough. So normally if I do the double recipe, I would already have extra flour in here, but I used all 4 cups of my single recipe. And just gonna take the dough out onto my floured counter and knead it a little bit more. And again, the same thing, not like folding it over on itself, but more so kneading it from the side and spinning it, and kneading it from the side and spinning it. If you've ever taken ceramics, which I know you took in high school, it's similar to clay. And after it feels like it's been like flattened and kneaded enough, which I don't really know what that means, it's more of a feeling, then we'll cut it into pieces to braid, not rip, because the gluten fibers are better to cut with a knife, not to rip in pieces. So I can tell it's ready because of a feeling, but also if you look on the counter, there's no more flour here, but it's not sticking. So it has enough flour in it, and it's not sticking. If it were sticking, it would need more flour. It's feeling really good. Nice and soft. Not too dense and not sticky. Now I'm gonna cut it, and I think I'm gonna do, this is where you can choose 4-string, 6-string, circular, 3-string braid. I'm gonna do 4-string. Honestly, it's just easier to cut more even pieces doing 4 rather than 3. And I'll take each one, and I don't think we need the video for this, but you know how to braid. I don't have to show you that. But one thing I guess I can show you is when you make it into a string, it's going to shrink back in size. Like you'll pull it out, or roll it, whatever, and when you put it down the counter, it shrinks back in size, and that's okay. This is its normal size, and then you just have to keep doing that a few times until it stretches out itself. You don't want to force it. Put it down and try it again. So I'll pause the video and then come back. Okay, so now I have my 4 strands to braid, and the ideal situation is that they're all the same length and they're all the same width, because the braid will look better. In my case, this one is longer than the others, and I have a few choices. I could cut it off and just use these. I could cut off pieces of it and attach them to the tops of these. Or what I used to do when PD ate challah is I would cut off a little bit from each of them to make it even, and then make a little spirit challah or a little PD challah out of the extras. In this case, I'm just gonna cut off the edge and do these 4. And I'm going to do a 4-string braid, which I always forget, so I have it saved on my phone to look at. And you put them together at one end. One thing I can already tell is I actually think this dough could have used a little more flour, because these are flattening as they're sitting on the counter instead of keeping their circular shape. But that's okay. It's still going to taste great. And I pinch the ends and fold them under. So you have a nice clean end. And then I do the same thing on this side. Sometimes the starting end looks loose, so I try to tighten it back up. And I pinch the ends together and kind of tuck them under. I get the baking pan. And then I'm going to lift up this challah and put it right on the baking pan. Oh, put parchment paper down. You don't have to, but just makes it stick less. And now, if you have, either you can pop it in the oven now, or you can let it rise again. I'm gonna let mine rise because I have the time today, and I'll cover it with the saran wrap. So it doesn't get like stale or hard. And sometimes I'll just put a little cloth on top to weight the saran wrap down. Or if I don't have saran wrap, I'll just put a cloth over it and it's totally fine. And leave it here for another half hour or so to rise. Maybe an hour. And because of my Jewish ancestors, I have guilt about wasting resources, so since this is a weekly practice for me, I take the flour that is left on the counter and I put it not back in the flour container because this probably has, challah pieces in it. But I can use this next week for my counter to be the flour that's on the counter. And if there's spots on the counter that have dough that's stuck to them, I'll usually take some hot water on my sponge and just squeeze the hot water onto the spots that have the dough, and I let it sit for a few minutes, and then I'll wipe it all up. Okay, now we're ready to put egg wash on the challah. I just uncovered it from the saran wrap and dish towel, and I'm gonna crack one egg into a bowl. And you can probably hear Petey eating his dinner in the background. And mix up the egg. And I already preheated the oven to 290. That's not what the recipe says, but it's what Maria and I found works the best. We cook it at 290 for about 35 minutes, and then for the last 5 or 8 minutes, we bump it up to 350. So put the egg wash all over the challah. Don't be shy. Get it in all the crevices. It'll make it nice and shiny, and it'll also make the topping stick. And you can choose whatever topping you want. Poppy seeds, sesame seeds. I, as you know, use everything but the bagel. And getting all the crevices and the sides. I've tried this with just egg yolk, and I've tried it with just egg white, and honestly I don't see much of a difference, so I don't think it matters. And I go generously on the topping because the challah is going to rise in the oven and the cracks in between the braid will show space. So that's our unbaked challah. Gonna pop it in the oven at 290 and set a timer for probably 30 minutes, and I'll check on it. And I actually save the extra egg wash in the container, and then I'll make breakfast tomorrow. I'll crack another egg into it or something and have breakfast tomorrow. Okay, so now I took the challah has been in there for about half an hour, and it doesn't look super brown, but you can hear it. It should sound hollow inside. I hear that. I don't know if you can hear it, but it sounds hollow inside. So Now I'm gonna turn it around just to get a little evenly cooked and turn it up to 350 for about 5 minutes just to brown the outside. Now I just pulled it out of the oven. It is nice and brown, and I have this cooling rack so that the bottom won't get soggy. And I'll just pick the challah up carefully with a spatula and put it onto the cooling rack. And then you have a yummy challah to eat with butter and or honey and or salt, and everybody's gonna love it. It's gonna be so yummy. Thank you, ancestors.